So class, raise your hands those who have been personally victimized by having your favorite shows cancelled way too soon at the hands of Netflix. And here you can assume that my hand is raised high. So let's talk about the gaping rotting wound left by Shadow and Bone. So Shadow and Bone is a little fantasy show that ran on Netflix for a grand total of 2 seasons between 2021 and 2023. The show was relatively short-lived. Its cancellation, of course, brought on the entire discussion of Netflix doing this because, well, they always do this and everyone hates them for it. But here's the thing. I believe that this situation is just so slightly more nuanced than simply blaming Netflix for it. At the risk of sounding like a Netflix shill, this is one of the rare instances that it is not only Netflix that should shoulder the blame for this. You see, this show is a bit different, and it stands out among other shows of the genre because while it is an adaptation, it is a quirky adaptation. The funny thing is that while the show has only 2 seasons, it seeks to adapt elements of at least 2 different series and a bunch of side content. The first season adapted at least 1 book and a set of characters from another, and the second season tries to touch on at least 4 different books from 2 different series and a whole load of side lore. If it sounds mental, well, that is because it kind of is. So to try and understand the full story here, let's have an honest reflection upon what led to the rise and the subsequent fall of Shadow and Bone. And to start, we have to look at something called the Grishaverse. So the Grishaverse, or Gregverse in English, sorry I had to, is a whole little literary universe of books authored by an American author named Leigh Bardugo. The Grishaverse began in 2012, when Leigh Bardugo published the first book called Shadow and Bone, which thus spawned an entire so-called Grisha trilogy consisting of 3 books, the other 2 called Siege and Storm and Ruin and Rising. Now the thing about these books is that, well, they are firmly located in the young adult genre, so it is no surprise that they act and behave like YA. The series focuses on a super special chosen one who has powers of a flashlight to fight a patch of dark space created by the dude called Darkling. The main character, Alina Starkov, is our underdog hero who comes from a disadvantaged background and therefore we should root for her. She has a love interest who is very toxic towards her, but fuck it, it's YA, so who cares? Yes, it is a chosen one story. Yes, it certainly very much fits the mold of a YA book. And you know what? I am not going to fault the trilogy for being that way. If it became popular, there was clearly a demand and a call for it, and Leigh Bardugo answered that call. There are of course some things that you can criticize it for. The quality of the trilogy is not the best, but it is relatively okay considering that this was Leigh Bardugo's first step as an author. There is also the fact that the world building and the coat of paint that the series has is based in Slavic culture, and it certainly has been criticized for how it handles that. You can still find a discussion on Goodreads of the author herself engaging in the discussion surrounding that. It's an interesting discussion to be had. And while the characters and the story might not be the best in the trilogy does leave us with something kind of worthwhile, I would say. That is its world. For all its cliches and faults, world building is kind of fire. The wizards of this world are called Grishas, they can control some things like wind and metal or a heartbeat, and their magic system is called the small science. We have saints who have their own unique little powers. It's kinda sorta Avatar The Last Airbender, but not really. Our main character is a flashlight. So we get to 2015. The last book of the trilogy was released just last year. Is this little Grisha world over? Well, hell to the no. In an amazing turn of events, the Grishaverse is expanded by a duology, that is the Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom. Now, I do not know about you, but I just couldn't really get into the original trilogy. The prose was serviceable, but the story was just not gripping. None of that was an issue in Six of Crows. Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom duology is easily the best out of the entire Grishaverse. Leigh Bardugo really improved the hell out of her writing and brought 2 amazing books. Seriously, if you're looking for your next read, check out Six of Crows. It was such an amazing duology and such an improvement, not to mention just how well it extended the world and how well it used what it had in its lore. Just all around amazing, incredible. It follows a group of thieves who engage in heists. It's amazing, and that is inevitably reflected in the discourse surrounding the trilogy and the duology. If you took a quick stroll down the good old Goodreads, you can see that the trilogy books sit between 3 and 4 stars, yet the duology books average 4.5 out of 5 stars with hundreds of thousands of reviews. Sure, user feedback might not be the best possible metric to judge anything, but it certainly sends a signal about which of these works has more merit and interest. The duology itself is not the end of the Grishaverse, and there are 2 other whole books in a duology out there. But this context of the original trilogy and the subsequent duology certainly informs what happens next. Before it is even released, this is where the show is beginning to perform a delicate maneuver colloquially known and referred to as shooting oneself in the foot. It doesn't know it yet, but you see, in January of 2019, Deadline goes ahead and shares the news that Netflix has decided to adapt the trilogy and the duology. It would have the author as an executive producer, and they also hired the person who wrote Arrival, Eric Heiserer, to create, showrun, and to write the actual show. Just a side note, go watch Arrival now. I am not telling you again, do it. It's so good, never fails to make me cry. Anyways, the article has some interesting verbiage in there. Shadow and Bone brings together the stories of characters of both Shadow and Bone and Six of Crows, two overlapping series that take place in Bardugo's Grishaverse, in a world cleaved in two by a massive barrier of perpetual darkness, where unnatural creatures feast on human flesh. A young soldier uncovers a power that might finally unite her country. But as she struggles to hone her power, dangerous forces plot against her. Thugs, thieves, assassins, and saints are at war now, and it will take more than magic to survive. So what they are saying is that they will be adapting both series at the same time? I find some of the wording here just a bit funny. Now, whether this is some creative writing on behalf of Deadline or something that came directly from Netflix, I do not know. But there is a nice piece of text that can help us understand the inherent flaws in the approach that the show proceeds to take. Two overlapping series is a particularly funny approach towards the trilogy and the duology if you have read them, because overlapping how, exactly? The duology takes place a couple of years after the trilogy. The tone is different, the pacing is different, subject matter is different, characters are different, plot is different. The only thing that these properties share is the universe that they are in and its magic rules. This is hell of a pickle to be in. To adapt two series at once, which have no real overlap in their plots, you would think that they would choose one or the other. And I want you to really think about it. From a purely practical standpoint, you either can have a single Shadow and Bone series focusing on a barely original, already done chosen one story with an interesting setting that did not really have as much buzz around it, or have a Six of Crows TV show that has an interesting story, an interesting setting, a set of compelling characters that people seemed to like way more. The most logical and probably correct course of action would have been to just stick to one, and one that has a stronger, better story. So why would the show choose this merging approach at all? Well, one of the explanations is that Eric Heiserer wanted it that way, but there is a twist in that. It isn't as straightforward. So the story, according to Heiserer, goes that Netflix initially only had the rights to adapt the Shadow and Bone trilogy. In an interview for CreativeScreenwriting.com, Heiserer admits that, "In my hubris to Netflix, I said I would only consider this fully if we could include the Crows characters and develop them in their storyline among the timeline of Shadow and Bone." So from this, all one can glean is that Netflix was always dead set to adapt the trilogy, even if it wasn't really that great of an idea. For your information, Netflix had the rights to Shadow and Bone according to Lee Bardugo ever since 2012. This is all obviously just an opinion coming from me, and it cannot be really proven, well, since, well, were we there? But it seems as though they had to be pushed a little to even have the Crows in there. But this is where things get a bit murky, because all of it, really, is more so a matter of perspective whether this decision was a good one. Because from this point of view, you could say that the showrunner's decision to bring in the Crows ultimately elevates whatever the Shadow and Bone trilogy might have been on its own. You cannot really deny that there is an incentive for marketing purposes as well. Adding the Crows in there also brings in more fans of the Six of Crows duology, which is arguably more successful than the trilogy. So with the context of Shadow and Bone trilogy being the origin of this entire ordeal, of course this makes sense that it would be included in the talks. But that mentality is ultimately not the one that is going to be applied by the vast majority. Because while on one hand you may say, damn, Six of Crows really elevates Shadow and Bone, well damn, Shadow and Bone really drags down the Six of Crows. Guess which one would be the more prevailing? And I can tell you it certainly wouldn't be the first option. It is all too easy to see why. Shadow and Bone as a source material would simply always be inferior to the Six of Crows. It does not matter how much you might try and fix the trilogy by making tweaks to characters. If you do not change the core story, it will always be inferior, as it simply is not as original or necessarily gripping. So with this yapping, let us actually see how the show deals with all of the setup. For all of my whimpering and moaning, the first season is actually kind of good. I do not even really have too many notes for it, quite a few compliments actually. The first season admittedly finds a very interesting way to use the Crows to enhance the story of the chosen one Alina Sarkov. The way that they bring them in through a mission to capture Alina is particularly organic, to tie together these two sets of characters. The very first episode is extra brilliant in this instance, of having one of the characters from Alina's side to run to the other side of the fold and then end up being interrogated by the Crow side of the fold. And that is a very nice decision. You also cannot deny that their addition into the plot fleshes out the world. The Crow characters themselves, I feel like, are added to service not a plot of their own, but rather Alina's, and they are really used in an interesting way to service Alina. Seeing the Crow side of the universe get all stirred up at the news of potentially capturing the Sun Summoner for profit certainly adds gravity to Alina's side of the plot, considering that we can see just how far-reaching the effects of her existence are. We also get to see her overall value even more established. We also get to see how Grisha themselves are treated outside of Alina's bubble through Nina, how valuable and influential the Saints can be to people through Inej. There is just really no way in which the addition of the Crows hurt the show. If anything, it adds suspense, expands the world in relevant ways, and props up Alina's story. And you also just can't gloss over the fuzzy feeling you get seeing your two favorite parts of the same universe interacting on screen. And all of that is genuinely epic and inspired. But you still cannot overlook the fact that Alina's story feels bland in comparison to the Crows. I found myself wanting to fast forward her bits upon a rewatch, because they were just not that interesting. And when you realize that it is her story that frames the entire show, it becomes not too great. The world building is also handled a bit poorly for my taste. This is gonna be a very personal pet peeve, but I did not like how they handle the language. It is kinda sad that they have a rich world, but they do not try to use the language differences to their advantage in any way. This is just a general pet peeve of mine that I have with fantasy shows with vast worlds in general, but it would be such an easy way to add a twist or two in there. But apparently everyone can just speak English, but then they also proceed to insert Russian-esque words into their speech. So is the show translating the language for us or not? Because if so, why the hell are we getting words such as
Mój carowicz, mój tsar.
It's literally just my king/queen or my czar in English. Come on now. Stop being needlessly quirky. Like, imagine you had a Spanish fantasy series and they all talk English and then someone throws in a random mi amigo just to remind you that it is indeed a fantasy world based on Spain or something. It just sounds so stupid and will never cease to piss me off. The show also kind of relies too much on the audience knowing the lore. Some of the things that characters throw around are not even that well explained, which is a shame because they are certainly not helping the audience get engaged with the narrative. Either way, this is the one instance where surprisingly, they dealt with the task of merging the two sides not too bad, and this was reflected in the reviews. For a young adult chosen one fantasy story, it received quite a warm reception. Critics liked it well enough, audiences liked it well enough, and so it received a renewal for the second season. So here's where we get into a very interesting place, because the show manages to do something that raised a lot of skepticism kinda correctly, and yet it manages to still make their approach backfire and ultimately probably kill the show. So the first season adapts only the first book within a trilogy. The Crow story is prequel material. Now usually how these adaptations go is that they try to tackle one book per season. That is pretty standard, and it kind of makes sense. Usually a book has a single arc in there and it makes for a nice translation to the screen. But then the news came out that they will be not adapting only one book from the trilogy for the second season, but two, and that the second season would conclude the adaptation of the trilogy. And now before everyone screams in the comments about how each book should have been a separate season, I will be a contrarian and say that actually I admire their desire to not to extend that storyline into 3 seasons. Let's be real, the story itself is pretty predictable. Obviously the big baddie Darkling is gonna die, and obviously Alina will find the amplifiers and tear down the fold. It is the fatal flaw in this YA story design. It runs quite comfortably within the blueprint of its story. I personally would not have waited around for 3 whole seasons for the story to finish, no matter how good the world building is. It just works way better as a 2-parter, a 50-50 share of a season for each book, and I appreciate their restraint with this choice. This would also mean that the season should be pretty grand, all things considered, since it would be somewhat of a culmination of all these issues we saw Ravka face in the first season. Tonally, it would probably need to be quite serious considering the subject matter. But there always is a but, isn't there? They also say that they will be adapting parts of the Crows duology, because remember, they are also there in the first season. They already set up a whole lot of material in the first season surrounding them, and surely they would want to follow up on that. And you also cannot deny just how much gravity the Crows carry within the show. If you go online and look at people talking about the first season of the show, you will find a lot of praise for the Crows. They are kind of fan favorites. Hot take, but in a perfect world, season 1 would have been the only season where these two casts would have overlapped for an entire season. They had a great idea for the first season, and they made it work. And that should have been it. In an even more perfect world, Six of Crows would be a separate show, but we got what we got. In a perfect universe where viewership did not really matter, these two casts would have parted ways. But now, you cannot really untangle the two entities within the show, since one of them cannot really exist without the other. Like, do I think that Shadow and Bone would have been as big of a success if it was written without the Crows? No, I do not. So now you end up in a situation where you want to conclude a story that takes 2 books to finish, and you also have a bunch of characters who should have their own storyline as well. But for all we know, this could also have been a mandate from the studio itself. And studio mandate indeed it was. According to the showrunner, one of the mandates that we received from Netflix going into season 2 was, we love the way that the Crows' storyline integrated with the Alina storyline eventually, and you have to perform that magic trick again. So we knew we had that challenge with them. So they kinda girl bossed too close to the sun with the Crows. Anyway, either way, this whole combination of circumstances was detrimental for the show, and the execution of season 2 is honestly just a bit triggering. The season kinda feels like a grand finale of the Grishaverse. I mean, since everyone and their mothers have been dragged into defeating the Fold, it feels like it's Avengers Endgame, but way worse.
I remember you. You were on the ship to Katadan.
Nina Zenit, Heartrender. Big fan.
I do not necessarily hate this season. Actually, I liked it a bit more upon a rewatch than before. It is watchable, but I certainly didn't like it as much as I did season 1. Yeah, so remember the 50-50 split I talked about? Well, think of it more as a 25-25 split, since this season has 2 whole storylines for the Crows as well. The first half of the season actually runs somewhat okay. The first 4 episodes are somewhat fine. We have Alina progressing on her journey, yet alongside her journey, we also have the Crows dealing with the aftermath of their own situation, which I mean, fair enough, but then the Crows deal with their own separate subplot in the first 4 episodes, because for some reason, the show decides that we need to adapt some bits of Crooked Kingdom and have Kaz confront and take down Pekka exactly there and now. Oh, and also, Tante Helene gets killed as well, with Inej barely reacting. Take that, book readers. And if I'm being completely honest, this content should not have even been there. There really is no reason for it to be there, considering that the plotline that the Crows get afterwards, which is to help out Alina and find a magic sword that can cut through Shadow, can happen without the material in the first half. The second plotline of theirs though is kinda sorta nice. I will admit that I am not particularly a fan of them trying to make the Crows a cast that originally in the text had diddly squat to do with whatever the hell was happening in Ravka, be still connected to Alina. It was fun the first time around, but I had enough of it and would have preferred to see them on their own path. Again, understandable why they did that, why they had to be here, but I just didn't like it. It makes every major character in the universe feel all connected, which is cool for about 5 minutes, and then it just becomes a bit of fanfiction. Like, I am sorry, but I was not exactly clamoring to find out that the Crows were actually present when the Fold was destroyed and actively fought Volcra. Also, that kind of already happened in the first season, so why did we need it to happen the second time? Then, in addition to these 2 storylines for the Crows in a single season, we also get another underlying storyline being developed with Matthias, who is now in Hellgate. And of course, we need to see entire scenes for him as well. This is set up for the upcoming heist for the Crows. And when you think about it, the Crows occupy a ton of space within the narrative, with substantial parts of their screen time being dedicated to things that have nothing to do with what the main story of the show is even supposed to be. But I am just honestly surprised and astounded at just how blatantly disinterested the show is in foregoing some bits of the Crows' lore in order to service the main story, which is Alina. Almost as if the Crows should not have been there in the first place. But I digress. And then we actually get to the Alina side of the plot. Again, not a bad idea to conclude it in 2 seasons, but wow, oh wow, did he rush it. So in that storyline, we have Alina track down 2 other amplifiers to complete a trifecta or whatever. We also have her be developing a relationship with Mal, and we also have her connection to the Darkling. Then we are introduced to a Ravkan bastard prince who wants to do good for the country or whatever else. We are also introduced to twins who have fierce and poetry as their core personality traits. On top of that, we get some royal family politics in there as well. And if things were not crammed enough, then we also have the Darkling doing his own thing and gathering followers in Grisha. Then we also have Jenny and David in there too, who get their own little romance storyline. It is a lot for a single season to shoulder. It is insane, and it certainly can feel a bit hard to follow, so something obviously has to give. The Crow storylines are somewhat fine, even if not always relevant, but Alina's side of the storylines suffer for it in the process. It is either the show skimping on some aspects of Alina's side of the plot, or straight up making the writing corny. For example, it always felt frigging weird how Alina went to the random library in Novi Zem, pulled up a random map, shown her little light under it, and managed to discover where the second amplifier is. Maybe it is how that happened in the books. I cannot say for sure, but it is such a convenience for her to just straight up find it marked on a random map. They easily could have fleshed out the search for it in an interesting way, but didn't. Then we also have Bagra, mom of the Darkling, deliver the twist reveal that Mal is the third amplifier. She just asks a few questions and susses it out, and that's it. And honestly, that kind of pisses me off, because it is things like these that could have been actually fleshed out properly and given both the world and the characters more depth, and also the events to just have more room to breathe in general. The concepts themselves that this season touches upon are so interesting, and I am kinda mad that the show doesn't pay more attention to them. The thing that Darkling keeps emphasizing to Alina over and over again about her saintly status and her ending up alone because everyone she knows will die is very interesting, and people keep talking about Alina in these various ways and how the world regards her, and that is just honestly excellent. The idea of a living person having magic powers and becoming a religious figure is neat, and I would have loved to see it more emphasized and reflected in the world. Then we also have the character of Genya, and honestly, I wish her character had more screen time. I love Genya. The actor for her is amazing, and I find her way more interesting than Alina herself. I like how she's used to show just how terrible the Darkling is. It was hella effective seeing her lose David and mourn for him, as it does emphasize the gravity of the situation. I liked the lore surrounding Mal. The only thing that really felt whack for me in this whole ordeal was the royal family, because they felt too camp and generic, but that goes for about any fantasy TV series. I feel like if they delved into these aspects more, they could have had a very neat season wrapping up Alina's story, because again, this is her story, this is her seasons. There's also the fact that the second season I think should have been way more serious and had way more gravity. The first season was tonally a bit lighter, and that is okay, since it was our first introduction into the world. But this is the season where things were supposed to get real, right? And when people sometimes say that they experience whiplash from the tone within a show, I could never really relate because nothing had really given me that much of a whiplash in tone until the second season of Shadow and Bone. There were multiple instances where there was a really heavy and serious moment on Alina's side of the plot that could have really used a moment or two of seriousness to allow it to hit, only for it to be immediately cut short by the Crows and them just quipping at each other back and forth, and that really did piss me off. Again, Ravka as a country is literally in such dire straits. Meanwhile, we have our little Crows over there having their little fun heist, and do not even get me started on that final battle in the fold. What a bunch of cringe that was. I did not want to see the Crows there at all. This is not Avengers Endgame, not everyone has to be there. So what we end up with is a season that is incredibly rushed, with a lot of plot points simply not landing hard enough because they literally had no space to do so, and with two shows rolled into one basically fighting for your attention, causing insane amounts of whiplash. And now, to add some insult to this injury, we already established that the showrunner of Shadow and Bone, Eric Heisserer, initially fell in love with the Six of Crows duology. Again, the two books are damn good, it makes sense, and it was his stipulation to adapt them alongside of Shadow and Bone. So yeah, it is clear that there is a favorite child, and the name of that child certainly doesn't rhyme with Bado and Chone. Throughout the research for this video, there was this interesting thread that was present throughout basically all of the articles and fan feedback surrounding Shadow and Bone. In a lot of interviews, the people behind the show kept mentioning the supposed idea of future seasons surrounding the Crows. For example, back when they were discussing season 1, they mentioned how a lot of material surrounding the Crows were being reserved for potential future seasons. Here, when talking about season 2, they kind of sort of repeat the same thing but in different words, only this time they talk about a whole potential spin-off focusing exclusively on the Crows. I feel like after a certain point, it all becomes the show kind of just running on the fumes of the potential future of the Grishaverse rather than the tangible present. And I am saying this because the mandate, as far as we know, was to include the Crows, but not rush through Alina's storyline. So it is rather telling that for season 2, Heisserer was joined by another showrunner to share duties. Meanwhile, Meanwhile, Heiserer created a whole different writer's room to write scripts for 6 of Crow Season 1, so you cannot help but feel like there was a lot of incentive to rush through the trilogy and finally get to the plots of the Crow's duology, which is not the best idea. It is very obvious that the people behind the show favor the Crows, and I think that they sometimes do that to such an extent that they ultimately forget to actually take proper care of the storyline that precedes their so sought after 6 of Crows TV show. Therefore, I was not surprised when, after months of waiting to hear anything from Netflix, the Shadow and Bone TV show was cancelled, and the 6 of Crows spin-off was never even greenlit. It is a very unfortunate situation considering that the merging, which happened because the Crows characters were so beloved, could be one of the reasons why they never even got their own show in the end. Of course, there is immense sadness over that, but there are still many questions that linger, with one of them simply being why? Why did all of this turn out this way? I want to emphasize that the following will be solely my opinion and not at all factual. Again, I was not there. I cannot tell you a factual account on why Grishaverse is now dead. I am just a random dude on YouTube. So here are just some of my thoughts. First, I suppose we should look at the fact of the cancellation itself. Netflix never truly released a clear statement and reasoning as to why they did not move forward with a decision to renew the show. But you needn't look far to grasp at least some of the potential reasoning. It is pretty well known that the second season did not perform as well as the first in sheer numbers. Granted, it wasn't a massive dive downwards from the first season, but it wasn't the same. The numbers might still seem substantial to the naked eye, but if I were to guess, it is not the number itself that is the most substantial metric here, but rather how that number is distributed. Simple logic would suggest that what matters way more here is the completion rate. Completion rate probably signals engagement, but also signals how many people might potentially tune into the next season. Think about it. How likely is it that a person who hasn't bothered to finish a season would tune in to the next one? While it is easy to hate and demonize Netflix, you cannot deny that there is a certain logic to be had here. And if you take a look at the second season, there is enough evidence to suggest that the engagement simply was not there. Again, think about it. The second season had insane pace, which may have resulted in either people getting a bit fatigued and lost in the plot, or people thinking that the writing is just not as good, since the pacing didn't even allow anything to breathe. Combine that with certain components of the plot just being a tad too predictable, and some characters just not being as engaging, and you have the perfect recipe for a viewer to become disengaged, which again, sounds awfully like it was caused by this desire to finish off the trilogy fast, which resulted in a very stuffed season. It is a decision within itself that seems rather misguided. Even without seeing the season, you can simply guess that it would result in a story that is just way too crowded to maintain any sense of quality. You needn't be a screenwriter to understand this. There seems to be internal awareness that they did need more time to develop these stories, so this decision must not have come lightly. In general, whenever you read an interview from the author or the showrunner, they do sound competent and level-headed about what they want to do, so this decision to make season 2 this cramfest just doesn't completely line up, and I would imagine that the impulse to go ahead and gather a whole writer's room for a spin-off and finish scripts for an entire 8-episode season didn't come out of nowhere and wasn't just some delusion. So perhaps it is best to put this situation into the wider context. It isn't a secret that Netflix is chasing their version of Game of Thrones, an ultra-popular fantasy universe that could become a big IP for the platform. While Shadow and Bone is not comparable to Game of Thrones, it is pretty damn obvious that they are desperate to get something going for them. I don't believe it is a coincidence that this TV show was greenlit the same year as the first season of The Witcher dropped. While The Witcher dropped months after the green light, it does suggest a general direction that the platform wants to take. I am saying all of this just to make a point that I can imagine a universe where the plan truly was to craft an entire universe out of this IP, and the showrunners simply acted like this was the case. Again, this is simply my thoughts and not factual, but I do feel like there had to be something more said or promised behind the scenes for this show to be approached in this way. It doesn't exactly absolve the decisions made within the second season. They are still kinda bad, and I have no idea who thought it was a good idea to speedrun books worth of material. Yet still, I feel hesitant in completely blaming one side or the other. I feel as though that both the showrunners and the studio have made some bad decisions along the way, and it all resulted in what we have now, a dead fantasy universe. But of course, at the end of the day, it all still hinged upon the performance of the second season. And it truly is a shame, because there was an entire movement of fans trying to make Netflix renew the show and the spin-off, an entire petition that gained quite some traction. And yes, I also signed it at the time. It is also a shame because the series had so much potential to be explored. The end of the second season left a lot of interesting threads to follow up. The 6 of Crows would have slapped hard if they just did that show from the beginning and properly launched the universe. I just imagine that not enough people were there to witness all of that in in the end. And that is just that on that. I suppose it is way better to churn out the slop that is Witcher since it's more popular or something, but what do I know?